Qualys is introducing a new prescription for security, and it's free. Global IT asset discovery and inventory. Activate it today at securityweekly.com/Qualys so you can achieve 100% near real-time visibility across your hybrid environments. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is unprotected attack paths that allow threats to compromise vulnerable targets in the cloud and data center. But traditional microsegmentation is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach. Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation, delivering results immediately with a security outcome that's provable and management that's zero touch. Driven by machine learning, Edgewise automatically builds policies that protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network. They provide measurable improvement by quantifying attack path risk reduction and verifying software identity before it communicates to stop application compromises and data breaches. To see how to eliminate your network attack surface, visit securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. I'm here with Matt Alderman. Matt, welcome.
Hey, welcome back, Paul.
And very excited to introduce our guest for this segment, Peter Kruse. He's the co-founder of the Danish IT security company CSIS in 2003 and is currently leading the e-crime department, which provides services mainly aimed at the financial sector. He's been investigating botnets for some time and very familiar with various types of viruses and malware. And a little history, we'll start off with that. So Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So Peter, how did you get your start in information security, and what were some of the first viruses that you were looking at?
It's kind of a funny story. For me, it began back in 1986, just like a decade ago, more than a decade ago. I was working on a Commodore Amiga. Some of you guys maybe remember that. And I was actually removing copy protection from games and learned reverse engineering in that way.
Yep.
So I learned assembly by the 68,000 processor, and that way I started digging into to removing copy protection on games. And eventually I got myself a boot sector virus. And since I was removing protection from games, I was unlucky enough to spread that boot sector virus around here in Denmark. And that's actually how I sparked my interest for computer viruses. That was back in '86. And the boot sector virus was just telling everybody that copied my program or to copy the games that I was distributing, that there was no virus on boot sector, which there was. And back then things were a lot easier. You could basically just open the computer virus, the virus up in a hex editor or in a text editor or whatever, and you could read whatever the virus was doing. So actually that sparked my interest, and I started collecting viruses. And I remember my mom asked me whether I could get infected by these viruses because back then in '86, the knowledge about computers were very low.
Infected, so, it infects you like health-wise infected by a virus, right?
Like in myself, really becoming sick. I think she might have thought that she was getting maybe a bit concerned about that. I was sitting there up until after midnight and still had to take care of my school.
Right.
You were only going to get sick if you continued to work all through the night not get any sleep.
And not get any rest, right? So collecting viruses back then must have been interesting because, there wasn't much of a communications network like the internet to spread those viruses, and they were spread basically by people handing out floppy disks, right?
Yeah, those were in the days with the boot sector. So you have to get infected by putting a disk in your computer that actually had a virus in it. Also, you could get some viruses back then by downloading stuff from bulletin board systems,
yep.
BBS, which were in their oldest stage. I remember back when there were movies like War Games, which inspired me to do war dialing and stuff like that. So actually, I've been for the very long ride, and it's been really interesting to see how the whole industry has changed. Back in I think it was 2001. I got hired by Norman, which is our Norwegian antivirus company, and I started looking more systematically into computer viruses. I had a long years of experience with computer viruses, so I was analyzing viruses at that time by a daily business. And then back in 2003, two years later, as you also introduced, I co-founded CSIS, which are doing various kinds of security services.
Now, Peter, it's interesting when we talk about botnets, and specifically in that time period, I remember around that time, I stumbled across a botnet, and it used IRC for communications. And I happened to see, clients on my network connecting this IRC server. So I would connect to the IRC server, and then I could see everyone else's, bots connected to it. Can you speak a little bit about that, and then how things have changed, from the days when IRC was used as a C2 channel?
Yeah, that's very interesting. The Internet Relay Chat was more or less an open channel. So as you just described, you could basically, if you knew the username and password, just log in and see all the infections that were rolling into the IRC. Today, the way of command and control servers are working in opposite to the IRC, a lot more complicated. The bad guys, they know they need to put encryption on top of the transportation layer. So they know exactly how to protect the traffic. One thing for avoiding intrusion detection system as endpoint, and the perimeter measurings, perimeter protection. So they are avoiding that in various ways. Also, you cannot really break into command and control servers like IRCs as you could back then, because nowadays they use even multiple layers. They usually have tier 1s and tier 2s, and behind those tier 2s and 3s, there are the real backend servers. So you really need to do some heavy reverse engineering and disassembling of the protocols to actually get any idea of what is being transmitted, and how the communication actually works into the command and control servers.
That's interesting. So there are still back-end servers that we can point to as being the main kind of server piece to control botnets today.
Yeah, the operators of botnets have a very sophisticated way of managing infections. They have more or less put themselves into a business with their own handlers, and they got people that are taking care of the infections coming in, and they're giving them value. They're making comments on the infections that are coming in. So they have a whole setup. I wish I could show you how they look, but basically, the command and control server operators, they can see what operating system that is coming in. They can see the usernames. They can see whatever is being typed on the keyboard. They can see in what domain controller the machine is attached. And basically, they can rate values of those infections they get in. I've been seeing for quite some time. I've been seeing even crime as a service, which is getting very popular in botnet operations. Crime as a service, where you can buy your way in. We've also seen advanced persistent threats in state sponsored operators that are buying them way into crime as a service botnets, because it's so much more easy, and you get hidden in the noise of when people investigate, say, common botnets like Emotet and TrickBot and DreamBot, or whatever we are looking at today. Very sophisticated botnets with some really business-oriented models where they have basically their own recruitment program with regards to recruiting money mules and packet mules. Basically it's run as a business.
Yeah, and that's interesting.
They even provide you with service level agreements and stuff like that. So when you buy your way in, you get the more the merrier. You get discounts on if you reach a certain amount of infections, stuff like that. So it's become a business. It's become a true business model.
So Peter, it sounds like that when you build a larger botnet, that you can compromise kind of like average everyday things, and that may make up most of your botnet, but some of them may entrench themselves into large corporations or nation states, and those are part of the same botnet but are ranked separately and probably bought and sold separately. Is that true?
Absolutely. You have the random infections where it's basically your neighbor that get infected, and and they have no clue that their PC is really leaking like all the information that is on the PC.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have also the also random attacks that hits big corporate networks. I mean, some of the large what we've seen, the incidents that occurred here in Scandinavia, and also that I know have been occurring in the US, related to ransomware that's been taking down huge botnets. It's actually been started with what you call crime as a service. That would be an infection beginning with Emotet, which is a dropper, a downloader, that would then eventually download the second stage, which would then be TrickBot. And then when the operators see this coming in, they can basically sell it off to people that have invested their time in taking down and putting ransomware into larger botnets and corporate networks. And those corporate networks, they're usually the plus 5,000 PCs. So if you get an admin account there, they push GPOs into the network, and they basically compromise the network through an infection that was originally started by a random attack.
And that part is done by a separate group within the same kind of criminal organization, right? Because there's people that do OSINT, there's people that do the initial infections, and there's people that monitor and maintain to keep those states, right? Like there's a whole hierarchy. Is that all part of the same criminal organization, or does it tend to be a little more spread out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it differs. It differs in the fact that some of the botnet operators, they are taking in, and they know that exactly when they get like a software development company, they can do supply chain attack.
Yeah.
Some of them are well aware that financial companies are more attractive. Some of them are doing more targeted attacks, and some of them that gets the random infections, they're selling it off to the highest bidder. So yes, it's kind of it differs from group to group how they operate the botnets.
Peter, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, it sounds like the different botnet operators have a relationship across each other, right? I mean, this is a network of these botnet providers, because if they're selling something off, then somebody's going to take that and run with it. So there's a lot of actual coordination going on behind the scenes to do this, right? Oh,
you have no idea. They build the same amount of trust that we build in the security community. Criminals actually get a vetting system that is similar to the ones that we have in our trusted communities. So the criminals, they are overlapping one another, and the different kind of approaches they're taking, they're kind of well aware of what group is doing what. Some of the crime as a service, you see gangs like Lazarus, you see certain APT groups, APT 28, Russian-based. Some of them are hurrying their way into crime as a service operations today, and using those to basically infect really targeted, whatever they want to compromise. And that works just as good as making a really complicated digital weapon that you could use months to develop. And what you get as bonus on top of that, you get to hide in the noise, because you're just part of a botnet operation that everybody knows that this was dropped by TrickBot, and then the third or the secondary or the third or the fourth payload is actually being dropped by an APT group that has been buying their way into paying off and bidding on infections. Yes.
Peter, I wanted to go back to the command and control channels for a moment. If you could give us kind of an overview, because I've seen lots of different techniques, and they're very specific as to how they rotate DNS servers, how they do the command and control channels. Like, what's an example of kind of those tiers as to how, once they compromise a system, what the communications look like?
Yeah, well, first of all, let's start with the DNS, since you're asking. So a lot of it is being, they use, some of them use fast flux, so they have the chance to stay online in the case that people are starting to take them down, dismantling the DNS. Many of them have redundancy. They have the domain generation algorithms, which are being taken in place in the case that some of the domains are being taken down. They oftentimes use multiple servers, and some of the servers are hosted in what you call bulletproof hosting facilities. So they have both the options of working with, for example, say Tor proxies. So you have they transport the communication into Tor and makes it anonymous. That's on one hand. And on the other hand, it can also communicate into a bulletproof hosting that is based on DGA or hidden behind the fast flux that are using multiple services, multiple servers across the globe. So it's really, really complicated. That is also why taking down a botnet is super complicated today. But some of them even used to that goes back to I think SUSE Go or Go SUSE. They used peer-to-peer. Nowadays, you don't see peer-to-peer being used, even though it's highly sophisticated, like 4 or 5 years ago. Today, they're using a multiple of different protocols and using sophisticated service providers that will give you the option to run fast lock services behind what you call a non-transparent service, where you can actually stretch your backends across multiple servers across the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think was the reason from the switch from peer-to-peer to a more server-based approach?
I think one of the examples was that the Go SUSE was taken down, and the peer-to-peer the way that it was taken down. If you look at that specific like peer-to-peer, it was able to inject at a certain point traffic into the peer-to-peer, and those dismantling the peer-to-peer botnet. So
I remember that.
People looked at it from the point of view, how could we set up something that is more stable, something that wouldn't be vulnerable to injection attacks into the peer-to-peer protocol. And that's why they started looking at various other methods of communicating. For example, one of those that we see quite a lot today would be Tor.
That's interesting. It kind of sounds like they're providing a software as a service, I'm assuming like a major provider like Netflix. When I choose what server I want to connect to get my stream, there's an algorithm that helps me choose a server. It sounds like the same thing.
That's exactly what they're doing. I mean, you have you have to see it like an online store of multiple kind of service providers, because you know where to go. Just like everybody talks about the dark web and talks about that you can there's even bigger dark web than the internet, which is completely untrue. But the fact is that a lot of criminals, they know exactly where to go. I mean, they hide out at Joker Stash, and they hide out at forums that are vetted. So they know that the people that they're actually being invited into those forums, they are people that they are used to be communicating with, used to be exchanging services. So you see a multiple layer of service providers that some are providing fast lock services, and some are providing crime as a service like botnet services. Some are providing a pay-per install. So you can buy like 1,000 infections and then transfer that into your botnet. So you see a multiple of various criminals that are providing very, very many different services.
Matt, sorry, you had a question earlier.
Yeah, Peter, you were talking about how these bulletproof data centers, right? We saw a story a couple weeks ago about one of these data centers being taken down in Germany. But you also said they come back online quickly. I don't know how much detail you have into that German takedown, but how quickly do these things come back online when you see something like a bulletproof data center go down?
Oh, I have seen some come up after even a few days. So if you look at the time that you invest into actually taking down a bulletproof provider by either null routing or dismantling or actually confiscating the servers, some of them are up and running. Not maybe the very same bullet provider, but since they are spanning across multiple service providers, then they're up in no time. I mean, you really need to be sure that you take all communication channels down at the same time. You do it synchronically, because if you don't, what will happen is that you'll basically just be out there in the press and stating that you now managed to dismantle a botnet, and within a week, the very same botnet is up in operation, and they're basically laughing at us.
Oh. So the amount of time it takes for law enforcement to go find these things and shut them down is probably way more than it is for these guys to just put their services back online and they're up and running again in no time.
Well, I did a presentation just recently at a closed conference in Strasbourg, and the title was Whack-a-Mole. And you can guess why I call it Whack-a-Mole. Is the fact that it actually is Whack-a-Mole game. That you take something down and you see 2 others pop up, and then you see 3 others, and then you take those 2 down, and you still have to deal with the 5 that comes up afterwards. So those guys have been learned to operate in the fact that those servers may not be up and running in like for months. They might be up and running even shorter time, but they learned to do so much redundancy that now they can basically switch over in very short time, and that they learned to live with the fact that law enforcement and security companies like ours are taking down their operations. Now they are getting much more resilient.
Yeah, probably some lessons learned for some of us if we think about it, right? They have these highly sophisticated multi-tier architectures. They have high resiliency in the back end, which allows them to bring services back up online very, very quickly. I mean, there are major organizations around the world that don't have that kind of sophistication in their architectures.
Oh yeah. So sometimes if you look at some of the management interfaces they're even more advanced than some large companies with them manage the users. Those guys, they can really the way that they run it like 24/7. They know exactly what users they're online at what time and what service they're accessing, and they're as I said previously, they are really good at pinpointing the target specifically, and in that effort they need a very cool management system, and those management systems, they're really so distributed today that they can be 24/7 online, as I said, and they can just monitor whoever might connect from Colorado or from anywhere in the U.S. and connect to any system. There would be people connecting to a financial system from inside a financial company making transaction, and they would basically record the whole transaction just to replicate the very same things that they can make fraudulent transactions out of the very same system. So they got it. They got it covered much better than some large international companies. That's for sure.
Peter, has there been research into who's writing the software that does the management interface? I can imagine that there's probably a smaller subset of people that can construct the protocols and the management interface. I mean, that is a software engineering, problem. Have we looked at who's actually writing that and selling that? And is that illegal? Or like if I write management software, is that, is that something of interest that could be potentially against the law?
See, that is a very good question, and I have to disappoint you with my answer to it, because the thing is that it's probably not illegal as long as you state that this is you have the usual disclaimer thing that you could do,
right,
that this is only for educational purposes, and you're not supposed to use it in legal ways. And since this is only like a part of the whole operation, you could basically also use it for legal management. For legitimate purposes. So I think it's a tricky one, especially when it comes to law enforcement. They has to go out and see whether they can arrest some of the bad guys. I remember not so long ago we were also looking at the guys that are doing the web injects. Web injects is one of the fundamental techniques when it comes to banking Trojans. Web injects can basically replace content of an infected PC. So when you walk into your banking system and everything looks A-okay, then it can replace the content of the website so they can bypass two-factor authentication, or even trick the user into installing, for example, an APK on your Android device.
Right.
So that's one side of the story. That would be the web injects developers. Then you have the developers of the management interface. Then you have the guys that actually maintaining the network itself, maintaining the routing protocols, maintaining that everything works as it's supposed to do, the redundancy functions. And then finally, you have the programmers, you have the developers of the malware itself. And they look at the way that this is, you can already imagine it's highly sophisticated. Taking down an operation like that, you really need to know who to aim for and how you get people arrested, because just taking down servers and taking down management interfaces really won't bring us anywhere. What we really need to do here, if you ask me, is actually go for the people that are programming the malware, because those are the ones that the other guys really can't do without.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say disrupting the supply chain is something that I had not considered before and certainly things weren't always as advanced, right, as they are today. As we give the example, someone would put up an IRC server and use, off-the-shelf software. It sounds like now it's very custom and there is very much a supply chain.
Well, if you compare it to an IRC, I would say that it's very limited what you could actually kind of commands that you could issue through the IRC. If you think about the functions today that are in the malware compared to the modern malware today, some of the banking Trojans are even more complex than your everyday advanced persistent threat. Many people really don't know that, but the level of complexity that are inside bank trojans is much higher sometimes than some of the APTs we've been investigating. Some of the what you call advanced persistent threat and targeted attacks coming from state-sponsored operators. Some of the programming is quite poor compared to some of the really professional groups that are doing 24/7 service level agreements and selling crime as a service on a daily business. They are much more capable and they're much better to protecting their infrastructure than your everyday state-sponsored attacker. And I think that's kind of scary and says a lot about how the business has evolved throughout the past 5 years.
So it's interesting, when I discovered some multiple botnets in the past, it seemed like that no one was really interested. Like they were just small enough and insignificant enough that it wasn't garnering attention, which kind of begs the question today, if you're a security professional investigating something and you stumble across things, like what should you look for, first of all, and what should you do with that information, based on what you found? What do you go to law enforcement with? When do you go to law enforcement?
Yeah, I think the whole indicators of compromise and the whole threat intelligence market has turned into a big thing. I mean, you need to know what you look for, because you basically won't be able mostly just to have a perimeter defense and to think that the traffic will be caught just like it did back in the days where you had like endpoint security, where the signatures in antivirus will pick up like the malware, and then you'll be good and it will be removed. I mean, look at it today. You have multiple components running on the client, and you have like many different things that you need to look out for. And the whole thing about incident response and forensics afterwards is super, super complicated. And you also need as a big corporate network, you really need to have an emergency response policy. I mean, if you don't, you will end up give me some examples. Like Maersk, the huge container shipment company here in Denmark, they got hit by the NotPetya, a very destructive virus that hit Maersk through the supply chain. You had Hydro, Norwegian huge company as well. There was also, all of them took major losses. And the thing is that if you get hit by destructive viruses, just as like ransomware, you will see that before you would ever have any like IOCs in your network. You might be able to block some of it based on your endpoint policies, and you might be able to defend some off. But when it really comes down to it, what you really need to do is have an emergency response plan, because if you don't have that and you don't know how to get back from a destructive attack, it's going to cost a company billions of dollars, like it did in the Maersk case, but also potentially it would cost the life of the company, because it would be without being able to deliver the goods that it's producing.
Now, I've heard where there are some disagreements in cyber attackers, if you will, that ransomware and denial of service attacks, that they're using this infrastructure for ransomware and denial of service, it kind of gives the attackers up, right? Like it's very loud, it's noisy. We're saying, yes, you've been compromised, right? And a lot of people in the underground don't like that, because you're basically burning all of your tools, right? Like you gotta rebuild. Do you also see that happening, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, 90% of all the malware we're looking at today has data collecting capabilities, meaning that the bad guys are collecting data and they're doing it in the hiding, meaning that you can have. I mean, we have seen companies that has been infected for months, even for years,
right,
without them knowing that they had an infection. And the people are just sitting there and sucking out data and intellectual properties and doing lateral movement in the network. And at one point, they decided they had enough, and then they made a destructive attack and pushing in the ransomware. So you also need to look at it from the different angles. I mean, the distributed denial of service attacks, I think, has come with the extortion things as well, as we've seen it with ransomware. I mean, at least for a few years back, you saw a swarm of distributed denial of service threats coming out from various groups, and the targets were being they tried to get money from the company so they could pay them to prevent from the distributed denial of service attacks. If you look at it from the ransomware perspective, it's just quite the other way around, because at that point they already got you by the balls. So if you're able to push a ransomware into a company and you have administrative rights, then the company is done. On the distributed denial of service layer, you can get help from ISPs and from people that are professional at protecting against distributed denial of service attacks. But it comes down to the very same thing, that is extortion.
Well, and it's interesting, you kind of alluded to the fact that you may gain a foothold into an organization, exfiltrate data, and you've collected enough data to be profitable, to be able to sell the intellectual property, and then do a ransomware attack at the end, because you've already really gotten most of what you needed. Is that a strategy? Yeah,
that's definitely a strategy. We have seen a lot of it also that has been doing that to hide their tracks afterwards. Some of them we even seen been in a company for a year, and then they decided to sell off the infection, and the guys that they sold them up to, they did a ransomware distribution instead. So I mean, if you look at that from that perspective, you would know that, okay, this company, they started with getting affected by this malware, and the malware then were used to leverage the ransomware. I mean, and that maybe come from two different groups. You can see where I'm going with this. The problem is that is making it very, very hard to investigate from a law enforcement point of view. But it still doesn't change the fact that every company has to get law enforcement involved when they see this kind of extortion threats, and they get hit by ransomware attacks, because else, I mean, you have like insurance companies also today, at least here in Europe, you have insurance companies selling off insurances to companies so they can protect against cybercrime attacks. And in order to get your insurance, you need to get law enforcement involved, and to get law enforcement involved, you also need to make sure that you got the evidence secured.
Right.
So it's hardly complicated to actually, from a company, even global companies, to find out where to begin, because it all began somewhere else than usually the ransomware, where it starts to hammer the whole thing down. I mean, there's something that has probably gone before that.
Yeah, it's interesting. That coordination, right? It's that coordination again of these different groups. One group may be just focused on collecting data, like credit card data for fraud. They've got all the data they want, and then they sell their malware and their command and control to somebody else who is really focused on ransomware. And now you have this multi-attack where the first attacker got all the data, monetized it because that's their specialty. They sold the underlying infrastructure to somebody else who specializes in another attack. And so you have this really interesting coordination and like focus of these different groups doing these multi-pronged attacks potentially.
Yeah, it's kind of scary, isn't it? I mean, we looked at a particular company in Canada just this week. Here in Denmark, we are lucky enough to have holidays with our kids this week, but nevertheless, we are still working. And some of my guys in operation, he rang me just that was yesterday actually. He just rang me and said we got a huge problem here, because we got a really big a Canadian online service provider that are taking in payments that have been compromised by the Lazarus group. Lazarus is North Korean, and they're probably state sponsored, but now they also bought their way into a crime as a service, and now they're infecting financial payment systems that we've seen it before, and right now ongoing with we're trying to get money out of a Canadian company, and a really big one. So this is super interesting. We also, I mean, I know I'm not supposed to get too excited about this, because it's also a pity, because it's costing companies a lot of money around the world. But one of the things I can tell you guys is that just 2 months ago, we were also looking at another botnet that we know is being used to crime as a service. We were lucky enough to gain access into the panel to have a look at what was going on in there. And one of the groups, again, they were paying specifically interest into Ukrainian government infections. And so they can buy them out. I mean, literally, just like a database. And every time work, you can just put in the text, and you can search for whatever you want to search for, and you have like gov.ua, government Ukraine, and then you get a result out of that, and then you can basically move those infections into your own distribution system, and you can then push something else from that infection you already have. That is That is very effective management of infections, because that you think about what you can do with that power. I mean, you can basically target any company you would like. You can have the old phenomenon, hire a hacker. You don't really need that, because you might already have the infection inside the any crime as a service botnet. So you can just walk in there and make searches for whatever target you like, and you can take over those for a little money.
It's super sophisticated. Yeah, I mean, how crazy.
It's amazing how things have evolved since I started looking at botnets, right? It's awesome. Peter, we just have 5 questions left for you in a question game we call Security Weekly, 5 questions with Security Weekly. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
They're super easy questions. One of them is multiple choice, and there's only 2 possible answers. So, question 1, 3 words to describe yourself.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're supposed to do this really quickly. Oh my God.
No, take your time.
I think I'm very motivated. I'm excited about technology, and I'm super curious.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Oh my God. Probably something digital.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
The Man Without the Plan.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
Second.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents. Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Oh my God. Stephen King? Well, maybe not. Maybe Jack Nicholson. Meryl Streep.
Fantastic. Peter, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
And with that will round out the show. Matt, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. Over and out.